China's decision to raise its military budget has gained attention in the U.S. as the announcement comes only days after President Trump called for a boost in defense spending.
The 7% by some accounts is one of the lowest rates of increase in the past few decades. That said, in whole numbers, it's still a fairly large amount.
China is spending more on its military each year, but the rate of growth has decreased. A slowing economy has caused Beijing to reevaluate how the country finances its forces.
The Chinese are undergoing another round of cuts in the size of the military, but much of what we're going to see in the spending is probably going to be in East and South China Sea.
China's control over disputed islands in the region has caused tension with its neighbors and Washington.
They want to make sure that the United States can't come in. Because remember, we have to sort of move into the region in force if something happens. We have commitments all over the world, in Europe, in the Mideast, and in Asia. That's why even though China spends less than we do on defense, they're spending that entire sum focusing on their ability to expand control in one region.
China has grown visibly more worried and upset over Seoul and Washington's THAAD decision. Our Kim Hyun-bin delves deeper into Beijing's rationale behind objections to the U.S. missile defense system, a necessity for Seoul's national defense.
South Korea and the United States decided in July of last year to deploy the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System on the Korean Peninsula to counter the increasing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. That can intercept missiles at an altitude range of 40 to 150 kilometers. Seoul and Washington have said on numerous occasions that poses no threat to Beijing. But China is strongly opposed to the move.
The biggest problem is that the U.S. will be in charge of THAAD. China is suspicious that the system could be used against them instead of North Korea.
Beijing is perhaps most worried about the system's X-band radar, which has a detection range of up to 2,000 kilometers. Once it's installed in Seongju County in Gyeongsang-buk-do Province, it will be capable of surveilling key facilities in China.
China is warning of what it calls a head-on collision involving the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea. It comes as the Communist North continues its ballistic missile program, while the South and the U.S. engage in high-profile war games. Correspondent Rich Edson is following the action tonight from the State Department.
China is proposing a deal between North Korea and the United States. North Korea should suspend its nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and the U.S. should halt its annual ongoing military exercises with South Korea. The answer from the U.S. State Department?
This is apples and oranges. This is not, what we're doing in terms of our defense cooperation with South Korea is in no way comparable to the blatant disregard that North Korea has shown with respect to international law and international concerns repeatedly about its nuclear weapons program.
The State Department says North Korea must move first to suspend its aggressive activities. And this morning, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, summed up North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
We are not dealing with a rational person.
So, as we just heard there, the Trump administration is working on a detailed blueprint on how to deal with the threats posed by an unpredictable and aggressive North Korea. We don't have a clear idea of when it will be out, but all options are said to be under discussion. Connie Kim has this report.
The new administration in Washington is pressing to complete a strategy review on how to deal with North Korea as Pyongyang accelerates its nuclear and missile development. Officials close to President Trump say all options are on the table. Tighter sanctions aimed at pushing North Korea back to disarmament talks, restationing U.S. nuclear weapons in South Korea, and even the strongest measure, launching preemptive airstrikes on North Korean missile installations. But for now, U.S. officials are ruling out the option of preemptive military action as it could ignite a devastating regional war.
Two bipartisan congressmen have presented a resolution today on Capitol Hill. It's called the Keeping Russia Out of European Elections Act. Its aim is to, again, lay blame on Moscow for Trump's win last year and to warn Europe that this could happen to them, too. The problem is that the public still hasn't been presented with any evidence that Russia may have done anything at all, both for elections in the USA and the old world. We're now joined in the studio by RT's Alexei Yershevsky. Alexei, thank you very much for joining us. break this down. This is a kind of kooky thing.
Well, it looks like one. It's not a bill yet. It's a resolution. It's non-binding, but it was presented today on the Capitol Hill by two senators, both they're bipartisan, one Democrat, one Republican, from Rhode Island and Illinois, respectively. It's called Keep Russia Out of the European Elections Act, and it starts, just go through the language of this resolution, by saying, whereas the unanimous conclusion of 17 agencies comprising the intelligence community of the United States concluded in a report, parts of which were declassified and released on January 6, 2017, that the government of Russian Federation was involved in influencing the elections for public office held in the United States in 2016. I'd like to remind that this is the report published by the ODNI, which had no evidence at all. It had assumptions, assessments, beliefs, nothing solid, and we felt here at RT that this was more a promotion of our network, because a large part of that report was dedicated to RT and the other Russian outlet, Sputnik, based in DC. Nonetheless, the resolution ends with a really tough language here that Russian officials have expressed their desire to divide the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance, weaken democratic institutions, and support extremist pro-Moscow candidates throughout Europe. And it's also the policy of the United States government to sanction entities and individuals within Russia or associated with the Russian government engaged in hacking, cyber attacks, propaganda campaigns with the intention of interfering in democratic elections.
It used to be that the Kremlin-controlled news outlets hailed the praises of U.S. President Donald Trump and his election to the White House. Now there is a word of backlash from those same outlets over the manner in which Trump has been engaging in the first weeks of his presidency. The latest headlines gracing the pages of several Kremlin-funded English-language networks read as follows: Sessions scandal. U.S. headed to constitutional crisis. Immigrants see American dream fade in wake of surge in hate crimes. And America is in the grips of hatred. Experts say that the root of the headline bashing isn't exactly that they've turned on Trump, but that Moscow's greatest desire is to consistently undermine the U.S. political system, regardless of who is in the White House.
Turning now to new developments in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. U.S.-backed Syrian forces are making major gains in the terror group's capital of Raqqa. Troops have cut off a crucial supply road out of the city.
Militants are also losing ground in western Mosul. U.S.-backed Iraqi troops are securing a key government complex after recapturing the base overnight. The UN says about 42,000 people have fled the city, while 750,000 remain trapped. Holly Williams is in the city of Erbil, just east of Mosul, following the latest.
ISIS is surrounded in Mosul and its fighters are desperate. But as we found out inside the city, they are still deadly.
ISIS fighters snipe at Iraqi forces who are closing in on Mosul's old city, the extremists' last stronghold.
Let's go.
Brigadier General Abbas al-Jabouri called in helicopter gunships yesterday, 350 yards from an ISIS position, where they were burning tyres to try to hide their location.
This is the plan. We are going to move forward. We are going to fight ISIS house to house to liberate the civilian, but we put a safe sector for the civilian if they want to come to us.
After 4 months of bloody fighting, the general estimates there are only around 2,000 ISIS fighters left in the city. But Mosul has been pummeled, and the city is smashed beyond recognition. Even now that it's cornered, ISIS is still deploying its favourite weapon: suicide car bombs, covered in homemade armour and laden with explosives.
Terrorists have attacked a residential area in the Syrian capital Damascus, killing a woman and injuring 6 other people. Syrian authorities say terrorist groups shelled homes with rockets in the Barza district of the capital. The attack also caused substantial material damage. Foreign-backed armed groups have wreaked havoc in Syria since 2011. A ceasefire agreement struck late last year between the government and militants has largely held, but the truce does not apply to terrorist groups like Daesh and Al-Nusra Front.
The conflict in Syria has always been complicated, but things in the north have really gotten tangled recently. This is Al-Bab. It's a medium-sized Syrian city recently taken by a mix of Turkish soldiers and Turkish-backed rebel forces. Right next to them are pro-government Syrian regime forces. This includes pro-government and Iranian-backed militias. These forces are also backed by Russia. Then, right next door are US-backed Kurdish and Arab coalition forces. Then there's ISIS. The Turkish-backed forces don't like ISIS, the Kurds, and pro-government forces. The pro-government forces don't like ISIS and the Turkish-backed troops. The Kurds don't like ISIS and the Turkish-backed troops, and ISIS doesn't like any of them. And throughout all of this, there are Russian, US, Syrian, and Turkish jets flying around in the sky. In fact, the Russian jets recently targeted villages held by US-backed Syrian Arab coalition fighters shortly after ISIS were forced out of them. US forces were less than 5 miles away at the time. And to make things even more complex, the Kurdish-backed forces, which, remember, don't get along with Turkey and their forces, have recently agreed to let the Syrian regime move into their territory. This is to create a buffer between them and Turkish-backed forces. US military leaders have given their recommendation on the fight against ISIS to the White House. And that could include putting more US boots on the ground.
For the first time tonight, we have confirmation that U.S. Marines are on the ground in Syria. Conventional troops with a specific mission as directed by the president. These are different from the Special Operations Forces that have already been active inside Syria. Let's get the latest on this breaking story from Pentagon reporter Lucas Tomlinson. He has the details. Good evening, Lucas.
Good evening, Brett. Well, that's right. U.S. Special Operations Forces have been on the ground in Syria for roughly a year. But just today, in a report confirmed by the Pentagon, first reported by the Washington Post, a detachment of U.S. Marines, along with their artillery, M777 artillery units, capable of firing artillery rounds about 20 miles to their targets. So that would bring these Marines very close to the Islamic State's de facto capital of Raqqa, Syria. Now, this increase in American posture in Syria comes just days after the U.S. military sent another group of U.S. Special Operations Forces to Manbij in northwest Syria. It's an increasingly crowded battlefield with Turkish-backed forces, Kurdish groups, Syrian regime troops, and Russian forces. The top U.S. commander in Iraq, which oversees the war against ISIS, said all these forces are within, quote, grenade range. Donald Trump just accepted a plan from the Pentagon, from Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, how to accelerate the mission against ISIS.
The United States may soon find itself at odds with Turkey over the role of the Kurds in the fight against ISIS in Syria. Oddly enough, Russia may soon become a key U.S. ally in protecting the Kurds against Turkish aggression. Russian and United States have agreed to buffer zones around towns in northern Syria where the Kurds are in control. Turkey has refused to allow Kurdish militias to play any role in future campaigns against ISIS in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor.
Roads leading to Kabul's biggest military hospital are blocked. Security forces were rushed to the area to stop a group of gunmen who had attacked the building located across the street from the heavily guarded U.S. Embassy. According to witnesses, the assault started with an explosion. Then, several men disguised as doctors stormed the facility.
I was in the operation room when a suicide bomber wearing a Dr. White uniform entered and opened fire at me. When he fired at me, I fell down on the ground, then the attacker shot my colleague. Somehow I escaped using a back exit, which was covered with barbed wire.
At least 400 patients are believed to be treated in the Sardar Mohammed Daoud Khan Hospital, mainly soldiers wounded in various battlefields across Afghanistan. The country is under a major security threat as the Taliban have stepped up their operations against government forces. Last week, coordinated terrorist attacks on police and intelligence forces, also in Kabul, killed and wounded dozens of people.
Israel is increasing its ability to defend against long-range missiles. A series of tests have been underway for some time to improve the Arrow and David Sling systems. Both are advanced missile interceptors. The Israeli army says that ramping up defense capabilities is a response to the conflict in Syria. In the Golan Heights, Iran-backed Hezbollah fighters are on the offensive. They say their aim is to drive rebels out of the area. But it's a move seen by Israel as an Iranian strategy to establish a military footprint on Syria's border with Israel. Since the start of the conflict in Syria, the Israeli military has stepped up its cross-border operations. This is moments after Israeli fighter jets struck a military airport on the outskirts of the Syrian capital, Damascus. Over the last few years, many senior Hezbollah officers have been killed in Israeli attacks in Syria.
Look, Iran, its basic policy, its whole intention in being in this area is, among other things, to eliminate the state of Israel. And Hezbollah boasts of its loyalty to Iran and its connection with Iran.
As Iran's influence increases, Israeli officials remain on alert. Their biggest concern is Iran delivering sophisticated weapons and missiles to Hezbollah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hopes to see Russia reign in Iran and Syria.
I think that his, let's say, main goal, maybe the goal that he understands he will never be able to reach, is to make Iran go out of this equation in Syria. I don't think that it's possible to do.
Iran and Russia have recently increased their military cooperation. Their goal is to ensure that President Bashar al-Assad stays in power. The Russian-Iranian alliance reached its peak in 2016 when Moscow provided Tehran with the S-300 advanced anti-missile system. A delivery that was delayed for years because of Israeli opposition. But as the conflict in Syria continues, the Israelis find themselves under mounting pressure to drive a wedge between Russia and Israel's main rival in the region, Iran.
They came to Athens to talk to the government. But this was the nature of the exchange: tear gas for stones. More violent protests on the streets of the capital. Once again, the police the focus of anger. The Agriculture Ministry remained barricaded, and workers peered down at protesters from their offices. There was talk of marching on Parliament and even the Prime Minister's office. Instead, the crowd moved to the headquarters of the governing Syriza party. There, the doors were closed, but the farmers lit fires and continued their protest.
Shouldn't every farmer and every worker be able to make a living? The Constitution says all citizens are equal, so why don't our members of Parliament cut their own pensions instead of ours? I'm uneducated, maybe I don't understand, but I think they're mocking us.
It's not just the austerity cuts. Farmers have faced a range of new taxes in the past 3 years. The latest is a social security law that took effect this year.
The new law broadens the tax base and forces all farmers to pay pension and healthcare contributions. And while for most of them that tax only amounts to about $100 a month, it comes on top of higher income tax of 22 to 45%, a higher sales tax of 24% on seed and fertilizer, and a scrapping of their fuel subsidy.
The government is in the middle of a delicate negotiation with its creditors, the Eurozone and the International Monetary Fund, over how much more to cut from government spending in 2019. It appears unlikely that it can offer any sweeteners to farmers or anyone else. Most farmers grew up on their land. They hate the idea of losing it or abandoning it for another profession. Leonidas Karvounis is a fourth-generation olive farmer.
I haven't thought about what else I'll do because I've always grown up with the idea that I'll have land and cultivate it. And farming is a foundation of the economy.
Farmers have weathered the crisis so far thanks to savings and the fact that they export most of what they produce. But now, those of them with small landholdings say they may not survive.
Farmers from Italy's quake-hit central regions of Umbria, Marche, Lazio and Abruzzo staged a protest outside Rome's Montecitorio Parliament building. The initiative, organized by the National Farmers Association Coldiretti, aimed at drawing the attention of the parliament and the government on the deteriorating situation of the economy in the regions affected by last year's devastating quakes. On August 24, a 6.2 magnitude earthquake left nearly 300 people dead, emptying a string of small towns and villages across Italy's mountainous central regions, with an estimated 40,000 people displaced. Farmers say the protest is held outside the lower house because they want to inform lawmakers how bad the situation is in the villages. The National Farmers Association Coldiretti has compiled a report that denounces major delays in reconstruction and the lack of initiatives to revive the economy in rural areas hit by quakes about 7 months ago.
It's all difficult, very difficult. Even waking up in the morning is hard. I'm a farmer and all of our barns went down. It's a disaster. We've not been even given a temporary place to stay. We are still in our camper van. Where have all the resources gone?
In addition to the quakes, we've had extremely low temperatures and snow across central Italy this year. The cold has killed over 10,000 livestock, and only 1/3 of the barns the government had pledged to replace have been delivered until now.
According to the country's civil protection, the series of deadly earthquakes that struck central Italy over the past 6 months have caused damages worth over 23 billion euros, while Coldiretti Farmers Association estimates the agricultural sector has suffered losses for about 3 billion euros.
This government has proved to be highly untrustworthy when it has to face tragedies like this one and support people. It has just allocated 20 billion euros to help Italy's struggling banks, but it has forgotten thousands of its struggling citizens.
Coldiretti argues that farming is the primary industry in the mountainous regions affected by quakes, and warned that a great number of farmers are struggling to find food and water for their herds, while damage to roads in remote areas is preventing farmers from delivering goods.
Brazil's famous samba spirit recently on display at Carnival. But there haven't been celebrations where the economy is concerned. The country has plunged even deeper into its worst ever recession. GDP contracted by 3.6% in 2016, taking a hit from weaker than expected figures in the final quarter of the year. Brazil's government is now looking to reassure, saying the downturn is bottoming out.
The economy is already in the rhythm of recovery, and so the idea is to maintain that rhythm, and we'll trace a methodology for labour for the next few years.
Officials point to indicators like improving farming output and car production, but many are frustrated with the slow pace of reform.
The trouble with the Brazilian economy, you may look at green shoots, it may easily turn out to be advanced mould when you see the problem that's occurred. This economy primarily, of course, is based on commodities, and obviously not coffee, it's iron ore, and obviously petroleum as well. But so the problems they've had have been there for several years. But Brazil's got a huge issue. I never thought I'd be in a position where people were actually comparing Brazil and Argentina and preferring Argentina.
Brazil's economic crisis has left nearly 13 million unemployed and fueled angry protests. That's putting extra pressure on policymakers to deliver on those promises of a recovery.
They may look like they're exchanging telephone numbers, but this man is actually a sales rep for a mobile payments provider, Paytm, and he's helping Meenakshi Sharma set up a merchant account for her furniture store. Her business is among 3.5 million retailers in India going cashless. Paytm's senior vice president says the mobile payments app is attracting many people who don't use banks and are not tech savvy.
We are trying to educate merchants, trying to educate a lot of new users, because we're getting a lot of new users who are not really comfortable with technology yet, right? So a lot of hand-holding they need, a lot of initial support they need.
Mobile payment apps have been gaining popularity here, and a recent ban on high denomination notes has given them a big boost. The number of Paytm users jumped from 125 million to 185 million in just 3 months following the currency ban. And people are spending $75 million through Paytm every day, more than twice the average before November of last year. That's helping India remain the world's fastest growing major economy, despite fears of a slowdown over the cash crunch.
I was always of the view that this will benefit India rather than have an adverse impact. And this will all actually lead to lesser use of cash, which is expensive and can be time consuming, and also greatly increase the reach in the rural parts of India.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said he wants India to become a cashless economy, and that could mean a lot more money and users for apps like Paytm.